Hey everybody, it's Andrew Protopappas, or Mr. Andrew, the Interim Education Director at Catco is Theater and Catco is Kids, and this is lesson number 5 in our video series that's all about playwriting. In our last video, we talked about conflict, and how conflict is the problem in a story. We also talked about the 4 major types of conflict: person versus person, person versus nature, person versus society, and person versus self. This video is going to focus on the parts of a story. Now, this is a really big topic, so I'm going to split it up between 2 lessons. This lesson will focus on the shallow side of parts of a story, and then in our next lesson we'll dive down deeper into plot structure and those parts of a story. Well, I think it's time that we went ahead and started. So I'm going to say that class is now in session. Before we jump into the parts of a story, there are 2 words that I want to make sure we talk about because we haven't discussed them yet. They are genre and plot. So let's begin with genre. When we talk about genre, we are talking about the type or kind of a story. There are 2 main genres: fiction and non-fiction. Fiction, as the librarian at my elementary school would always say, is fiction, fiction. It's a made-up story from an author's brain. It's a made-up story. It's not real. On the opposite side, we have nonfiction, which means that it is real. It's not made up. Now, there are some genres that kind of are on the line between fiction and nonfiction, like historical fiction could go there, and that's a really cool way of combining nonfiction elements and fiction elements. I love when stories are historical fiction. Now, there are a lot of other genres that fall under nonfiction, like biography, autobiography, and so on. There are a lot of genres that fall under fiction, like science fiction, fairy tale, fable, fantasy. The reason why I wanted to make sure that we talked about genre was that when you choose what genre your story is going to be, it ends up affecting who the characters are and what happens in the story. If you decide that you want to write a fairy tale, well, you probably shouldn't have aliens from the planet Venus come in a UFO and try to abduct everybody in the castle. That wouldn't quite make sense. Now, I'm not saying you can't combine genres, because that happens a lot too, and when it works, it's awesome. So I'm not trying to discourage that. But what I am saying is if you choose to write a fairy tale and you want the story just to be a fairy tale, you kind of have to follow the structure in a fairy tale for your story to make the most sense and to be the best fairy tale that it can be. So, apart from genre, I wanted to make sure that we also talked about plot. When we use the word plot, we are talking about what happens in a story from the beginning all the way to the end. This is usually thought of as a sequence of events. How one event leads to the next event, which leads to the next event, and so on and so forth. So plot is what happens in a story from start to finish. Well, let's begin talking about the parts of a story. So remember, this is our shallow end of the information. So there are 3 main parts of a story. They are the beginning, the middle, and the end. Now, depending on the part of the story, different things are actually happening in the story. So, at the beginning of a story, we learn about who the characters are, we learn about the setting, we're also introduced to the conflict. It's always great to have a little hint of what the problem is going to be at the beginning. We basically learn everything that we need to know to understand the story at the beginning, which leads us to the middle of the story. In the middle of the story, the problem gets more complicated. The conflict grows, and it keeps growing. It gets bigger, all the way to the point that it can't get any bigger. That is a moment in a story that we will talk about in our next video. When the problem can't get any bigger, well, eventually the problem starts to shrink back down. And so things kind of get fixed, which ends up leading to the end of a story when the problem is fixed. Now, if you're writing a sequel, or if you want to write a sequel for a story, you can leave a little hint of like a bigger problem that's going to be happening in the next story, but you still need to find a way to wrap up the problem in your story. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video as well. So the three main parts of a story are the beginning, the middle, and the end. And depending on what part of the story you are reading or you are writing, different things happen. And they kind of follow the descriptions that I use to describe each part of the story. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. And I want you to think about, if we were going to draw this story, what would it look like? Now, I don't mean draw it like animate the characters. I mean, if you were going to draw it as a line, how would you draw the line? So, here's my story. Once upon a time, Mr. Andrew woke up and he was really tired, and so he drank some coffee, and he realized that he was really hungry, so then he made some toast, and the toast was really good, and then he went to work, and then after work, he decided to watch some TV, and then after he watched TV, he looked at the time, and it was like 10 o'clock at night, and he thought, oh, I should probably go to bed, and so Mr. Andrew went to sleep. The end. If I were going to draw that story, I would draw it exactly how I drew it right here. A straight line. Not only was that story really boring that I just told, nothing happened in it. Technically, Mr. Andrew was the protagonist. I was the main character in that story. But there was no problem in the story. And even though I did all these things in the story, like drink coffee and eat and work and go to sleep, there was no problem. There was no conflict. So the story didn't go anywhere. It didn't grow at all. So, with that example in mind, I'm going to turn things over to you. Here is your activity for this lesson. I want you to once again think about your favorite story. Think about what happens in the story. I want you to make 3 columns, one for beginning, one for middle, and one for end, and write down all of the events that happen in the story from the start to the finish. And think about, do they belong in the beginning column, in the middle column, or in the end column? Now, one last thing I want you to do. Once you've done that, I want you to think about how you would draw as a line your favorite story. Would it be a straight line like the story that I told? Would it be a story that's like wavy, a wavy line? Would it be a spiky line? Would it kind of look like a hill? Would it look like a mountain? What do you think? Well, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Be on the lookout for more videos and education updates from Catco is Kids. For more information about our summer camps and classes and how to sign up for them, go to our website at www.catco.org. Thanks again for watching, and as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay creative. We'll see you next time. Bye.